Okay, so we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to try and catch us up today or get us closer to being caught up. I've got some leeway in the schedule because of the way I planned for the IMC planning process so that you'd have some time in class to do that or work on that. I'm going to check and make sure that we are actually okay. That's good. I can hear the video or the audio, so we've got audio, so the speaker's working. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through media planning, chapter 10, and then try to do chapter 11. And what I'm going to do is so that I have two distinct videos for the purposes of when I update the videos for the online classes. When this is a fully online class, I'm going to stop the video and then start another live stream. So it'll be a little disjointed today in class, but that'll make it easier for students who are watching the videos in the online classes when we teach this online. So we're going to talk about media planning first, and then we'll talk about television and radio. So once you've developed your IMC plan, once you've come up with it, you need to get media to implement that plan. So how do we do that? And what kinds of media are we going to use? This is not an easy process. It's difficult because there are multiple options. You have to select among mass media, things like television, newspapers, radios, magazines, out-of-home advertising, billboards, signs on buses, things on public transit, benches. You see advertising in Oklahoma City on park benches, advertising in various locations, sponsorships, things like that. Direct media or direct selling, things like professional selling, using promotional items. And then of course, in the contemporary era, we have a host of new media that are emerging and that are becoming to play more and more important roles in how we reach people. One of the things that I point out throughout the semester is that when we talk about things in this class and when the textbook talks about things, it's often directed at large corporations like Ford and Tesla. And those companies obviously have a lot of resources that they can throw at these things. And so when they say that it's not an easy task, if we are looking at large organizations, that's true. It is not an easy task to come up with these and then to decide, for example, which kinds of social media you're going to use and how you're going to utilize that and how it's going to impact. But for most businesses, the vast majority of businesses in the United States, it's less complicated because the choices available to those businesses are far more restricted. So for example, in my family's own business, when we started out, opening the first bed and breakfast here in Oklahoma, we couldn't afford to get on television or even radio. So, I mean, the avenues for advertising that were basically open to us, and that was before the age of the internet, were newspapers and magazines. That was, so we were limited. And most companies, the vast majority of companies in this country are small to mid-size. And so one of the things when we talk about this is that we have to recognize that with regard to those small to mid-sized firms, which many of you will work in, at least initially, your options are going to be far more limited. Although with the age of the internet and the advent of the internet, how you utilize that can make it very complicated. So for example, in my family's own business, we started out by advertising in the Oklahoma Gazette.
Did you guys go in Yellow Pages too?
We did have a Yellow Pages ad at that time, but it was really small. We primarily advertised in the Gazette, and that was because the Gazette was the least expensive newspaper that we could advertise in. And, as a small business starting out, we couldn't afford to advertise in the Daily Oklahoman. At the time that we opened in 1986, the Daily Oklahoman was, if not the most expensive, one of the most expensive newspapers in the nation to advertise in. It was the heartbeat or the lifeblood of sort of conservative, aligned with the Republican Party print media. And it was enormous. I mean, people took the Daily Oklahoman that never lived in Oklahoma because they wanted the conservative slant. This was before talk radio really got going, and you had shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh and others And so the Daily Oklahoman was actually had a huge circulation even beyond the borders of Oklahoma, because people would subscribe to the Oklahoman because it had this sort of very conservative political leanings, and so they would subscribe to it to get national news. And it was one of the most expensive newspapers in the nation, so we couldn't afford to advertise there. We advertised in the Gazette. Now we don't even advertise in newspapers anymore. We do all of our advertising online and through social media, and so that can complicate things, because one of the things you have to think about with regard to social media is how are you going to reach your customer and which ones are you going to use? Because if you don't utilize them well, your customers can become turned off. If you're not engaging with it and you're not posting frequently, things like engagement can fall off rapidly with your customers. So that can create problems. But historically speaking, lots of businesses didn't really have, particularly small businesses like my family's didn't have the access to television or even radio, and to put up billboards and things like that could be expensive. So it was much more limited. So media planning involves the decisions that you're going to make in the delivery of the promotional message. These should involve considerations of what your target audience is most likely to utilize and engage with. If you want to reach millennials, or even younger than millennials, now we have Generation Z that's entering the workforce. They've grown up with this device, constantly being accessible. And so you have to think about that. If you are targeting, a population that is a traditionalist population, those people now that are 62 and over, or even baby boomers who are now in the 62 and over demographic, what kinds of media are they going to be more likely to utilize? Many of them don't utilize the things like this as often. So yes, they're going to listen to things like radio and television. They still like print media, right? They still like to look at magazines and newspapers. You used to go into doctor's offices and they would have lots of magazines on the coffee table. You go into a doctor's office anymore and they have no magazines or anything on the table because everybody's staring into their phone. But people like my aunt, who is not technologically savvy, still tends to carry magazines around with her when she goes to the doctor, so she'll have something to do, something to look at. So the media objectives should be specific goals that you're going to achieve with your integrated marketing communication plan. And then how do you plan to achieve those goals? Selection of the medium. Which category? Are you going to use television, radio, print, internet, out of door or out of home advertising, things like that? How are we going to get that? Then within that, once we select the categories, we have to look at the specific media vehicle. Which company are we going to use? So if you're going to use advertising, car dealers advertise on television a lot. They use local ad spots rather than national ad spots. Which ones are you going to use within that specific category that you've targeted? Are you going to use 4, 5, and 9, or just one of those major channels, or are you going to use local cable channels, things like that? What is the reach that you want to have? So for example, in my own business, and I use my family's own business a lot in examples because I have obviously direct experience with this. Historically speaking, when we first started out, our primary customer base was Oklahoma City and people who wanted a 3-day getaway to some place that was close and convenient. When we started in 1986, that was sort of the height of the oil bust. So Oklahoma's economy has largely been dominated until very recent periods of time by cycles of boom and bust dependent on the oil and natural gas industry. The oil and natural gas industry was going great guns in the 1970s, and then the Saudis decided to turn the taps on And they did, and they flooded the market, and oil production, went to a screeching halt sort of in the 1980s. And when we started our business, that was heavily impacting what was going on in the local market. So we were heavily reliant on people who were looking for some place that was close, that they could still get away and have a nice, 3-day vacation, rather than taking the grand tour to Europe. And that was what we targeted. As the economy started to come back in places like Oklahoma, we expanded our reach. And so we started advertising in Dallas and Wichita because we recognized that people from those areas would also be interested. We started having a lot of people that were related to people in Dallas and Kansas that were calling their family. And so we started tracking the numbers of people that we had from those states visiting. And we expanded our reach to include newspapers in those areas to get that. Then the coverage, and then, I've got a typo, frequency, not frequency.
Oh.
That's frequency. So how frequent are you going to cover?
I was gonna ask.
Yeah, that's obviously a typo. They've adjusted my contacts and I'm not seeing real well. Every time they do this and I go to the eye doctor, it disrupts my vision for a few days. I use the monovision, so I only wear one contact, but every time they adjust the prescription, it seems to affect my mind, and apparently I didn't catch that typo, so I'll try to correct that. It's frequency. So the goal is to find the combination of media that delivers the most effective and efficient IMC message. So effective and efficient. Those are not the same things. Efficiency is you want to get the most bang for your buck. And effectiveness is you want to reach the target that you are attempting to actively influence and get them to respond to your message. So you have to adopt the plan as conditions change. Again, when we started in business in 1986, there wasn't the internet. And so we had to rely on print media to get our message out. Now, and we spent an astronomical amount of money on print advertising. I think during the 1990s and into the early 2000s, we were spending something like $3,000 a month on our advertising budget. That has gone to almost zero as we've been able to rely on social media for more and more. And you can get that at just, a fraction of the cost. Even if we boost ads on Facebook and things like that, it's really relatively inexpensive compared to what it used to be in the past. So we've adapted to changing conditions. The vast majority of our customers are not going to be picking up magazines and print media because we tend to attract sort of 30s to 40s professionals in the business that we have. Those people are going to, be less influenced by picking up a Gazette, or if they do look at the Gazette, it's going to be usually in the online version. So we've had to adapt to those kinds of conditions as things change. And it used to be that those conditions changed, gradually over a number of years. When we started out in 1986, again, that was the dominant form of advertising, was television and radio, newspapers, magazines, billboards, things like that. Then when we get the internet, initially it was very slow. They were static ads. So companies would put up a website. It wasn't interactive. It didn't necessarily have an ability for you to communicate back to the company. That's all changed, and it changes enormously quickly to the point where now one of the things that we're looking at is the use of artificial intelligence in order to communicate with your audience. How many of you have used ChatGPT? A couple of you. So this is giving businesses the ability to really, really engage with their customer in ways that seem very much like you're talking with a real person in many instances, the use of artificial intelligence. And it's frequency is increasing. There are lots of problems with it. One of the things that they are now able to do is to deep fake things. And in the political world, one of the things they're having to respond to is this deep faking of, for example, President Biden has been deep faked, and they've put him into videos that make him appear like he is, drunk, or that he's losing it, that he's not mentally competent. And that's been posted and reposted and picked up by groups online. And I mean, the same thing is happening on the liberal side. They're doing the same thing to Donald Trump in many instances, which, by the way, a major event is happening today. And this, of course, since I teach political marketing, is relevant, and it's relevant in IMC because obviously political campaigns are now using integrated marketing communication techniques in order to influence at greater and greater numbers and in a much more sophisticated manner than they have in the past. So what's happening in the world today that's of major importance in terms of history? Yes.
Is it like Trump, something about Trump?
Yep.
Is he getting indicted or something?
Yep. He has been indicted. He will be arraigned today in New York City. And they've actually fundraised off of this. They've been using this indictment by the district attorney in Manhattan to fundraise for the president's campaign. You have Lindsey Graham going out, he's a senator from South Carolina, telling people that they need to donate to Trump so that he can fight the left wing, and it's ridiculous, I think, to me, that they're asking people to donate to support the president so that he can fight the liberals when he's flying to New York City from his Palm Beach home in a jet. But he's raised $7 million since the announcement of the indictment was handed down. We don't know what's in the indictment. It will be unsealed today as he makes his first initial court appearances in a courtroom in New York City, in Manhattan, right? So this is part of political communication and political advertising. They're using this to fundraise, and we're using things like artificial intelligence and deep faking to come up with ways of reaching consumers, or in this case, voters, in unique and novel ways that they haven't before in the past. As I was coming in today and listening to this, one of the things that they're doing, there is a Supreme Court race in, I believe it's Wisconsin today. Let me look and make sure that that's correct. It's either Wisconsin or Minnesota, and they were talking about it on NPR. I think it's today. Let me make sure that's correct. Yes. So Wisconsin voters are going to decide today a Supreme Court election of Wisconsin. And one of the reasons that this is interesting from a political marketing standpoint and from an IMC standpoint, from an integrated marketing communication standpoint, is that this race will decide the balance of power on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. When the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, which was the 1973 decision that allowed for women to have the right to choose nationwide, the issue went back to the states. And many state Supreme Courts now have started looking at the issue of whether or not women have a fundamental right to an abortion, not under federal law and under the United States Constitution, but under their own state constitutions, and whether or not the state constitutions protect a right to privacy. And that guarantees them the right to have things like reproductive choices. So this is going to be critically important in the Wisconsin race, because this seat will decide how that court will likely view challenges to state laws that the legislature is enacting with regard to restrictions on reproductive choice. The interesting thing from an IMC perspective about this case is that women in other states have started using dating sites in order to try and get out the message on reproductive choice. They're actually going out, the Democrats have actually gotten women to go out and change their profiles. This is really very unique and specific target marketing. They've gotten them to change their profile locations so that they show up in Wisconsin. And then they're attempting to influence voters. And one of the people that they had on NPR was a man who started communicating with a woman who's actually in, since it's in Wisconsin, I think she was in Illinois or something like that. And she's actually now going to go on a date with somebody that she met, but she started changing her profile and the demographics and the location that she was targeting so that she could try to influence this race in Wisconsin. That is, I mean, that's a completely novel way of engaging in integrated marketing communication, to use people to basically micro-target people in a very specific kind of way. And so this is just illustrative of how these conditions change. In the past, if we went back to, again, the 1990s, in the early ages of the internet, it didn't have much of an impact. We were still largely advertising on television and radio, and things were shifting a little bit because in the 1980s, like 1970s and 1980s, people started getting these things that you've never seen called VHS, which were made by Sony. There was an earlier version which was called Betamax, and my family actually had a Betamax. But one of the things that did, and there's a very famous court case involving Sony by holders of copyright who alleged that Sony was engaging in contributory infringement of copyright holders' works by allowing people to record video programming from the television. And then people were using this, and the reason that copyright holders were concerned about this, particularly television stations, was it was the early ages of allowing people to basically record a television program and then be able to fast forward through the ads and not have to listen to the ads, right? And now we've got zipping and zapping that's widely available through, video on demand and through the recording on your digital electronic devices. But it's gaining, now we're seeing huge changes. It's not just in terms of whether or not we're using this device, but are we using individuals in a way to specifically micro-target, using, for example, dating devices or dating apps to get people to influence political elections. What artificial intelligence has the ability to do right now, what's happening in this area is there are actual women who live close to that area that are changing their profiles to go about this and engaging people in that area to try and influence them to change their votes or to consider going out and voting. Statistically speaking, people who use these apps tend to be younger, and your generation historically has been more receptive to sort of the Democratic response, God bless you, than the Republican response. But this is a completely novel form of sort of influencing people and developing a campaign to do that. Could you do that with now artificial intelligence? Well, at this point, probably not. But in 6 months or less, could the Democrat Party or the Republican Party put together, bots that basically go out, create profiles on these dating sites, and then try to influence elections? Absolutely. I think you could see that. And the ability to interact. Again, when in the early ages of telephones where we had, select 1 for English, 2 for Spanish, things like that, the ability for computers to interact with individuals was very, very limited. Now you can get really, really sophisticated artificial intelligence agents that are taking questions and are able to answer questions for customers in a much more realistic way. So the problems that we have in media planning are there's insufficient information. It's oftentimes difficult to get absolute statistics on how much we are increasing our sales based on the IMC plan. Of course, that is getting better and better again with technology that allows us to track. In the early ages of the internet, we could start tracking whether or not we had click-throughs. Now we can track that with much more precision, not only click-throughs, but how many people are buying, eye tracking movements, things like that, that will focus on what you're actually paying attention to in the screen. There are inconsistent terms that are often used that create problems. In many instances, there's time pressure. If we think about my example today regarding political campaigns, one of the things that happens is, and I used to work political campaigns, and I think I told you all, I sit on the Guthrie City Council, is there's a definite beginning, a middle, and an end. There's an end date. The date the election happens, it's all over, right? And the closer you get to that end date, the more pressure you have to get those last remaining sort of swing voters in, and this can create huge time pressures. And so that can be difficult, that can lead to difficulty in measuring the effectiveness of your campaign. So all of these things are problems that we have to face in the media planning aspect of our IMC plan. So developing the plan begins with, and again, your text is giving you what you should do and the steps you should take. And you have to recognize that these steps are usually only available to the larger companies that have the ability to access more resources. So market analysis. For companies like my family's business, we couldn't conduct sophisticated marketing analysis when we started, right? What we had to do is we had to sort of rely on information that was available from sources that gathered sort of information on industries that we were interested in. So when my mother decided that she wanted to start a bed and breakfast in Oklahoma, we looked at things like, you know, there's a National Bed and Breakfast Association and sort of the statistics. I mean, my mother has a degree and she's owned several businesses, and so she was more sophisticated than most. She looked at these things, but obviously larger companies like Ford, Tesla, you know, Google are going to be able to do in-depth market analysis of their products and services. Then you have to establish your objectives. What is it you hope to achieve? Develop your strategy. Then implement the strategy, and of course, evaluate and follow up on the strategy. You can't just put the plan on the shelf and not do anything with it. So the market analysis starts with your SWOT analysis, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, your identification of your target market. Who is it that we want to sell to? Again, when we started in 1986, who was it that typically went to bed and breakfasts?
Older couples,
You think it was older couples?
or like families traveling.
It was actually middle-aged professionals was the group that bed and breakfasts are most likely to target. Why? Historically speaking, at that point in time, there was actually a television show about a bed and breakfast starring Bob Newhart. It was called Newhart, and he owned this bed and breakfast with his wife in the television show in Connecticut, I believe is where the setting was. And it was sort of the, you know, odd happenings of a small-time innkeeper in Connecticut dealing with his rural neighbors and his sort of bumbling handyman and his housekeeper who was a former socialite whose parents had disowned her. And it was kind of a funny show, but typically speaking, bed and breakfasts were attractive to sort of professional classes. They were generally tended to be more expensive than what you could get a, you know, motel room if you were just traveling through with kids and stuff like that. Lots of bed and breakfasts didn't have televisions. We didn't have televisions in our rooms. If you have kids, that was a big deal. Kids want television at that point in time. Now kids don't care about television anymore because you've got one of these or you've got an iPad or something like that. So identifying your target market and then deciding where it is that you want to promote your business or service or what constituency. Then you have to come up with specific goals, establishing your objectives. What are your specific goals that you want to achieve? Is it, if you're launching a new product, like when Tesla was launched, to make people aware of the product, to get them to just become aware of the brand. When Tesla started, right, they're not the first fully electric. There was actually an electric vehicle years and years and years ago, but this is sort of the first mass-produced and viable electric vehicle. And there's a lot of resistance to that. So getting people to sort of become aware of the product and its advantages. Most people at the time that Tesla was launched would not consider an electric vehicle because they didn't think they could go very far. It was limited. Now you can go, I have a friend who has a Tesla and he goes cross country all the time in the Tesla and he doesn't think about it any more than you think about stopping and filling up. The car will tell you where the nearest charging station is. And it will basically, let you charge for 10 to 15 minutes, about the same amount of time that you would use to fill up a tank of gas and get you to the next sort of, spot down the road, 250, 300 miles or whatever it is. It should be measurable and then obtainable. So how are we going to measure the goals that we've set? Again, this can be difficult. One of the things that we've done since the earliest days in 1986 when we started was we ask every single customer, how did you hear about us? When they call in and they make a reservation. In the early days, it was overwhelmingly, we saw your ad in the Gazette. And then is it obtainable? So developing your strategies. Using the media mix. What are you going to use? Are you going to use television, radio, online, the full panoply of the media mix, personal selling, promotions? Very few companies actually use every single thing available to them, even large companies. My sister works for Boeing. She's a vice president of business development for Boeing. So she basically sells for Boeing. She sells C-130s, I think is her current product. Well, they're not advertising C-130s on television or radio. Why? I think that's what she sells. Maybe it's something else now, I don't know. But why? Well, who buys C-130s? The military, right? Like, I mean, you're wasting coverage if you're trying to sell this product to the average person. Most people, are not at all interested. Even if they're interested in it, it's as an aviation enthusiast, not as a purchaser. So looking at your target coverage, geographic scope, what is your geographic reach? One of the things that I use as an example for this is I have a Yamaha Wave Runner. I like to go to the lake. It's a fine thing to do in Oklahoma in the summer because the temperatures in Oklahoma oftentimes exceed 100 degrees. And if you're looking for something to do that's outside, well, lots of things are really hot and sticky and miserable, but get on a boat in the middle of a lake, float around and, tie up with your friends. That's something you could do in the hottest days and have a good time. So Yamaha advertises lots of products. They have personal watercraft. They also make motorcycles and things like that. When I was getting my PhD in Las Cruces, New Mexico, if you went to the Yamaha dealer, would you think that you would find a lot of wave runners in Las Cruces at the Yamaha dealer in New Mexico? No. Why?
There's no water.
There's no water. They asked when I was getting my PhD, I may have told you this story before, but it's redundancy is good. When I was getting my PhD, they asked students in Las Cruces, I think in the 5th grade, where they were most likely to see a boat. And the answer was on the highway. Because there's no lake in Las Cruces. They get their water from groundwater or the Rio Grande Valley. They don't get it from a lake. So students in that area, they saw boats on their in transit on the way to places that have water. If you ask students in Oklahoma where are you likely to see a boat, they're going to say a lake. if you asked students on the Gulf Coast of Texas where they're most likely to see a boat, it's going to be in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So geographic location. What did they sell a lot of at the Yamaha dealer in Las Cruces? Well, there's lots of open space out in the desert on which to ride, quads, ATVs. And so they had all of these places that you could go and ride quads and side-by-sides and razors and things like that. So that's what they sold rather than selling wave runners. They would order them. I think they had one when I went to the dealer there. They had one on the floor and they would have to order it. Whereas if you went to the Yamaha dealership here, they have both. They have quads and they have the personal watercraft, because both of those things are very popular in this part of the country. Because you can go up to Little Sahara, just north of Enid, and you have lots of area there where you can ride side-by-sides and quads. And then we've got lots of lakes that you can use personal watercraft. Scheduling, when are you going to run the ads? What is the reach that you want? How frequently do you want it to run? With regard to things like television and internet and social media and mobile device, you can have much greater frequency than if you're using print media, which you have to have into the publisher by a deadline, right? The recency, how recent have you done it? You can get over coverage, for example, and reach saturation. And then maybe what you want to do is you want to back off so that people don't become, they have some anxiety. One of the things that happened at the beginning of, sort of the new promotional era, promotional items historically have been coupons that you got from a newspaper or a magazine or some kind of tangible source. Now they started coming up with digital coupons. One of the first large companies to come up with this was something called Groupon. And Groupon went like from 0 to 60 in no time at all. And now almost nobody does Groupon anymore, because one of the things that happened is that there's just oversaturation and people have stopped responding to it. One of the successes that Groupon had, I think, was they only offered in their earliest start one deal a day. That creates anxiety in people, right? Because they know that if they don't get the deal today, what's going to happen to the deal? If they're interested in the deal, you can't necessarily get the deal tomorrow. And we experienced this after the initial growth of our business. We would stop advertising in the Gazette for a while, because people, if they see you every single week, they may want to come and go to a murder mystery and do the bed and breakfast, but they think, yeah, I'll do that another time, or I'll do that later, or they put it off. If you retreat, one of the things that we found is that if we didn't advertise every single week, the Gazette was a weekly, people didn't see the ad and they started to think, oh my God, well, it creates a sense of urgency. Groupon did something similar with those daily deals. There was one deal, or they ran it, then they started running them for multiple days. Now they run all kinds of deals and you can get, for as long as the business wants to run them. So the recency effect, creative aspects of your advertising. Flexibility. How much flexibility do you have to be able to respond quickly to changing dynamics? That again depends on the type of company. If you are a fad, if you're one of these companies that comes in and disappears, makes a lot of money and then disappears very quickly, you need a lot more flexibility than Ford, for example. And then budget considerations. What is your budget? How much do you have to spend? Again, initially, when we started the business, didn't have a lot of money to spend on advertising. As we got bigger and we grew more, and at one point in time, my mother had 6 bed and breakfasts in Guthrie, and she started them and sold them. We had a lot more budget than we did in the early period. So evaluation and follow-up. How well did the strategy achieve the media objectives? And how well did the plan attain your marketing and communication objectives. Using that to then tweak the plan. Again, as an example, we started out advertising initially every single week in the Gazette. And then as we started to notice that there was less and less response from people saying they saw us in the Gazette, we would back off and not advertise, for 2 or 3 weeks sometimes in the Gazette, or we would switch to advertising in Wichita or Dallas or places like that, so that you could change. Any questions about media planning? Okay, well, I might actually get us close to being caught up. So we're going to talk about television and radio next. I'm going to end this live stream and start a new one for purposes of making it efficient to put the videos embedded in the D2L.
So we're doing the 11 now?